Hey, this is Dr. Flight. I hope you're doing great today. Got a video today on pricing. And so this will be an introduction to pricing, but also walk through a model called the 5 C's of pricing. So when we design price strategies, there are a lot of different moving parts. Pricing is a really important component of how we create value, but then also how we assign value to whatever the product or services that we've created. Pricing is formed, and the process is done in relation to a lot of different moving parts. One, of course, would be the company or the firm's cost structure. Another would be the customer, of course, what the customer can afford, what they're willing to pay, all in the context of the competition and all the other options that are out there that a customer could use to satisfy their need other than your product or service. So there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of things to consider, and so we'll look at those things through the perspective again of this 5C model. So in this video, we're just going to talk about 2 of the 5 C's, and then in other videos, there'll be other C's that we look at as well. So again, in this video, we'll look briefly at company objectives that you put in place for setting price, but then also we'll spend a good amount of time on costs, and we'll talk a little bit more about costs here in just a second. First, though, let's look at those company objectives. So when we set cost or price, we have certain goals and objectives that we want to achieve regardless of what the marketing activity is. And so being consistent in trying to reach those goals would be no different for setting a price strategy. But we'll just talk about what some of those might be here. So being profit oriented means that we want to think about profit margin as kind of our focus. We might also think about return on investments. That's another way we can kind of view a profit-oriented type of a focus, or maybe a target return of some type. But again, these goals are going to be profit-related with the profit function in mind. And so we'll talk a little bit about that here when we say, what is profit? Well, it's the difference between the money we bring in and the cost that we have to pay out. The difference between those two things would be our profit. And so how do we maximize profit? How do we maximize profit per unit and things like that? So institute a company-wide policy that all products must provide for at least an 18% profit margin to reach a particular profit goal for the firm. This 18% would be maybe something we could call, in finance terms, you might call it a hurdle rate or some type of a benchmark, ROI, some type of a benchmark saying, look, if we're not going to make at least 18% on our cash flows coming in, then it's not a profitable enough product or venture for us to get into. So we're going to say that will be the benchmark, that's what we'll set, and that will be our profit focus. Okay, and that determines price. And a lot of companies use this as a process, use a cost-oriented type of a thing. Another objective might be to say volume, units sold, or maybe market share might be something that we look at. Set prices very low to generate new sales and take sales away from competitors, even if profits suffer a little bit. Now, why would profits suffer if you're selling more units? It's a great question, and it's simply because when we lower our price, we lower our profit margin, right? Because the difference between our sales price and our costs has narrowed because we lowered our price. So selling lots of units may come at a sacrifice of profit margin, and you have to do a little calculation, a little bit of math just to kind of figure that out. It's not complicated, but it's something that you want to do always before you lower price. You want to know what the impact of that lowering the price will be on total profit. Okay, another element or another goal here or objective we may have from a company's perspective would be our relationship with our competitors. Again, remember when we influence our price, when we change our price, we're also changing demand for our product. And if we're going to sell new units or more units, that demand's going to come from somewhere, and it may very well come from our competitors. So in other words, we may take customers away from our competitors by lowering our price, but certainly our competitors are not going to just sit around and accept that. They're going to take actions to counteract our price change. So, being able to manipulate your price in an effort to manipulate your competitor's behavior is called a competitor orientation. It's when you're focused on your business strategy, and its impacts on the competitive landscape. You may want to lower your price, and by lowering your price, you might put a lot of financial strain on your competitors, and they will in turn decide to leave that product line. They might get out of the business of your product just because it's not profitable for them anymore. And so that would discourage competition, of course, and it would encourage people to come buy your product. The last one here is something called customer orientation. Now, here's the goal. We want to identify the price point that customers will buy our product at. And, we want to meet profit goals. We want to influence competition and all those types of things. But at the same time, we also want to satisfy a market. And if we create a product and because of the process we use or the costs and such, that product has to be priced really high, then that determines the type of customer we're going to get. And it's going to focus in on a particular type of customer who can afford the product that we're offering. So when we manage our price, we're also managing our customer and our customer's expectations. We have to be able to justify the value of our product through the benefits and features we offer them. And that justification has to be reflected in our price. We can't price too high based on what we're giving them, but also we don't want to price too low either because people will question the quality of our product. So you want to understand kind of the customer's perspective and their price sensitivity and what they expect from a value proposition that we're offering them. Okay, so again, think about when you're setting price, what is it we want to accomplish as an organization and a firm, and then that will help you also kind of move forward in a pricing strategy that you're going to engage in the future. Okay, the second C we're going to talk about here is going to be costs. And so there's a bunch we got to talk about when it deals with our costs, our cost structure. And again, a lot of companies will use costs as the basis to set price. Again, this is done in a lot of organizations, a lot of retail organizations. They'll say, hey, look, it costs us X amount to produce this product or to buy this product. I'm going to resell this product at my cost X plus some profit. So a cost plus profit type of a strategy, something we do. Challenge here is we need to know what costs are. So the costs that we're talking about relate to the overall expense of producing the value that we're going to sell and that customers are subsequently going to pay for. So costs have to be absorbed by somewhere, somehow. Somebody in the company somewhere has to pay for the operational expense, the overhead, the accounting expense, everything that you write a check for or do in an organization has to be paid for, and it has to be covered by the revenue that we bring in, which is reflected in price. So we always start with this idea of what is our cost, and then what will we set price at based on that cost. Again, most companies use this kind of concept of a cost-based pricing model. So this is something you should know about and be familiar with. Also, from accounting, we need to know and you need to be aware of just simply what the names of certain costs are. Okay, so we have something called variable cost. Variable cost is the cost that we contribute to or attribute to each unit of production. So the more units you produce, the more your costs are. So think about direct labor costs for producing a unit of good, or direct input costs like of raw materials that would go into each single unit of good. Okay. Second thing, big one, of course, is called fixed cost. Fixed costs are costs that you pay. We might call them overhead or some other term that says, look, we're going to cover these costs, and it really doesn't matter how many units I produce, per se. I'm going to produce a number of units, but I can't really attribute this cost to any particular unit. So think about costs that are bills that you would pay every time period, no matter what. So you'd pay insurance, for instance. You'd pay electric bills, very likely, right? Every month. You pay for water and utilities. You'd pay for some overhead costs, like for managers and for the executives and the administrative staff. Those are all things that you'd pay for, more or less regardless of how many units you produce. So those are all fixed costs, and we treat those a little bit differently. We'll talk about those a little bit more. Total costs are your variable costs. So this, you can calculate total costs as a whole or by unit. So you take your variable cost and you multiply that by the number of units you produce, and then you add to that your fixed cost. That'll be total cost. So how much does it cost to produce my product? Well, how many units times the variable cost plus that overhead cost, because we still have to pay that no matter what. Okay. Cost per unit is going to be calculated a little bit differently, but you should know how to calculate this. It's your variable cost this time by itself plus fixed cost divided by number of units. Okay, so if I have a fixed cost and I produce 10,000 units, that fixed cost divided by 10,000 is then what I add to my variable cost per unit. Okay, then finally we're going to talk about something called contribution per unit. So this one here is a term you don't always hear a lot, but it's something that's super important that you need to know. And it's simple, it's not challenging, but it's basically this idea of, look, if I sell one unit and I pay for my variable costs, how much do I have left over that will contribute to overhead? Okay, so let me say that again. So if I sell a product, I account for the variable cost, and then the money I have left over after paying for variable costs, I have that money left over to pay for all the other expenses that I've incurred. So it's the contribution of that sale basically to the overhead or to the fixed costs that I have, or to profit, right? That I can do. So the money I have left over after paying for the variable costs, I can do with whatever I want. Pay down overhead, I can invest it, I can save it. There's lots of things I can do with that. And it's called contribution margin or contribution per unit. And it's just price minus variable cost. Okay, so be sure to pause, check your book, study however you need to. You need to know each of these different costs. You need to how to calculate them, and you need to understand kind of what they are. Okay, so this helps us as we move forward to something called break-even analysis. Now, break-even analysis is sometimes helpful. You don't see it a lot, I guess, in practice, but it's something from a planning perspective you should know. And there's going to be a couple things that are going to be fluid about this that are challenging in reality, and that's why it's bit there. So you take into account, you need to know a few things. You need to know price, and you need to know your costs that are associated with producing a unit. And basically, and ultimately, you're going to need to know demand. And the reason why it's a little fluid is because demand changes when your price changes. So if I calculate a break-even point, this calculation for one price, I'll have what it is in demand, but if I change my price, that would change. So it's not linear, and so it's a little messy sometimes. But basically the idea of break-even analysis is to find the point where your total revenue will equal your total costs. So again, revenue is all the money you bring in. Costs is all the expenses associated with bringing in that revenue. Where does that meet? Where does total revenue equal total cost? Now, a couple things to know. At that point, we call it the break-even point. You cover all your costs, but you have not yet made any profit. Okay, and this picture kind of shows this, where we have a total revenue curve that starts at 0 and then goes at a steeper angle kind of up, and then we have a cost line that starts, if you see, it starts at the $100,000 and is a shallower line than the revenue line, and you see that at the break-even point those two meet. So it's where revenue and costs equal each other. And below that point, we haven't profited yet. After that point, we have started to earn a profit on our product. So that's why it's kind of an important part. It tells us how much revenue we'll have, to break even, and it tells us how many units we need at a specific price to break even. So how many units we have to sell, right? And so this is an example. This was for a hotel room. How many we have to sell, and we're going to have a couple things here that you'll know from the last slide. We have fixed costs. Those are overhead costs, are $100,000. So even if I don't have any customers, if I don't sell any units, I still have $100,000 that I owe, that I have to pay. Then there's a cost per unit, and this is $10. And again, this is a hotel example, so $10 per night per room is what you'd think of as that would be the maid service and the cleaning service and those types of things that are accounted for as a guest stays in a room. And so we have this variable cost, but that we pay per unit. But then we also have this fixed cost. So this is it. Now let's walk through the calculation of this, because this is just a graph, but let's go through the calculation of this. So the break-even point, and this is going to be in units, so this will be a demand, will equal the fixed costs. Remember that fixed cost was $100,000 in that last example, divided by our contribution per unit. Remember, contribution, it's going to be our price minus our variable cost. Price minus variable cost. Remember, that's contribution. So there are some examples. I'm going to have 2 or 3 different examples here. We have a fixed cost here of $125 million. Variable costs are $54. This is for a television. And we're going to sell this television for $495. Okay, so we've got our fixed costs for our formula. Now we need to know contribution per unit. Okay, remember our price minus variable cost, that'll be our contribution per unit, $441. And then we're going to just divide it out. Break-even point is $125 million. Remember, that's our fixed cost divided by our contribution, $441. So our break-even point would be 283,447 units. Now that's how many units I need to sell to cover all my costs. I haven't made any profit at that, but I've covered all my expenses, right? So that's your break-even point. All right, another example. We're producing sandwiches, and our fixed costs are $500,000. So I have a restaurant. I have expenses for that restaurant. This might be over like a period of a year or something. Let's say we're time horizon. We have our fixed costs. We have variable costs per sandwich, $2.23. And on average, I sell my sandwiches for just under $7. So our contribution margin, again, it's going to be our sales price minus our variable costs, be $472. Break-even point, $500,000 divided by 472. That's 105,933 units. That'd be sandwiches. So if I sold that many sandwiches, then I would cover my costs. And think about this like over a 1-year period. I have my expenses, I have my cost for the sandwich, and that's how many sandwiches I'd need to sell. Now, is a little bit more complex in the real world because we wouldn't just sell a sandwich, we'd also sell a soda and chips and other items, right, that would also contribute to our fixed costs. So if I only sold sandwiches, this is how many sandwiches I'd sell. If I sold other items with sandwiches, then this would go down, right? I'd like have a bundle of products and they would all contribute to fixed costs. And so, so I might not have to sell 105 sandwiches. Maybe I think about it as meals and I bundle it together and I figure it up that way. Okay. One more example here. So suppose you produce sandwiches, we had a lower fixed cost, and we raised our price a little bit. Okay, so think about this. I'm changing this up a little bit where I'm lowering my fixed cost, my price is going up a little bit. And it looks like maybe my variable cost has changed a little too. Calculation is the same. We're going to find our contribution margin, our contribution rate per unit, divide by 450,000 now divided by that. And now the number of units I need to sell dramatically decreases. So that's actually really quite a good thing there, right? And that's break-even analysis. So be sure to understand how to calculate this, walk through the examples, practice, and you'll be in good shape. All right, so one final piece here we'll talk about. Again, this is a cost-oriented type thing. Companies do this all the time. What we do is something called markup over cost. We also call this target return pricing. Basically the idea is, let's say I have a cost and I have a 10% return that I want. I'm not going to look at break-even analysis. I'm not going to look at the customer. All I'm going to say is, look, I want a 10% ROI is basically what it is. What am I going to do? So there's a couple ways you can do this. We can do a percent markup, or we can do some type of a nominal markup. Typically a percent markup is used quite a bit. And so here's again an example. You see the formula there. It's not complicated, but you do need to remember it. You do need to memorize it because this is something you should know how to do. Let's say I produce 100,000 scarves a year and I want a 50% return. So in other words, I want 50% above and beyond cost. And so I have these fixed costs, I have these variable costs. Kind of what is it I'm going to do here? So my per unit cost is my variable cost plus fixed divided by my number of units. Remember, because I need to know my cost per unit, right? So my unit cost. So how much does it cost to make one scarf? Which means I have my variable cost, but then I have a little bit of the cost associated to overhead. So my per unit cost would be $275 plus 150,000, which is my fixed cost, divided by my number of units. So that's $1.50. So my cost per unit is $4.25. So every scarf I produce, I need $4.25 to break even. That's my break even point in dollars, right, for that particular thing. Now, that's my cost per unit. So remember this formula, price is cost per unit plus unit cost times whatever the markup is. And I want to earn a 50% markup. Okay, so look at that again. We've got our price, remember, $4.25 plus 425 times 50%, which is going to be what? 212 and a half. So 212 and a half, that's going to be my profit. That's my 50% markup. And then I'm going to add that. So I'll sell the scarf for $6.38, and I've made a 50% return on this particular product. Many companies use this as a pricing strategy. Many retailers use this as a pricing strategy. So you should know this. Now, this doesn't take into really full account of what the customer is willing to pay, but that's what this is from a cost company perspective in terms of pricing. All right, so what are the 5 C's of pricing? Make sure you review those 5 C's. Identify the different ways we can set objectives for the firm, pricing. So there are 4 of those. Understand the difference between variable cost, fixed cost, be able to calculate break-even point, and also markup price over cost. I'll also throw in there with the fixed cost, variable cost, understand contribution per unit. That's something you really need to know in order to be able to calculate break-even point, and just in general, conceptually, you should be familiar with what that is. Okay, so there's a lot here. There's math. You're going to need calculators to do this, and kind of have an understanding of what these variables are and what these formulas are. They're not super complicated. None of them are, but you do need to remember them. Okay, let me know if you have any questions. Have a great day.